The death or life of great American cities, and the love or disdain of great American cities. Jane Jacobs, History, Theory, Legacy. Was born in 1916 in Scranton, Pennsylvania. After attending primary school, during her late teens, she moved to New York with her sister in 1935, just past the peak of the Depression-era dynamics in America. Attending Columbia University, her studies were varied, focusing on sociology, architecture, history, and economics. After working at the State Department for America magazine as a writer, she moved on to write for Architectural Forum magazine. It is important to note that Jacobs regarded herself primarily and solely as an author. In addition to her work in regards to urban planning and economics, she always perceived herself primarily as an author, fundamentally as an author. Not to lose sight of this fact, as her easy writing style with a common-sense narrative voice provided the widespread exposure that allowed her to reach such a broad audience. Her published works, as pictured below, span the genres of both narrative, nonfiction, economics, city planning, and sociology. As she would later note in her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jacobs was of the opinion that planners should focus on preservation in neighborhoods, keeping them as diverse, walkable, mixed-use areas, paying close attention to the added and inherent value of older buildings with a noted slant against any automobile-centric development. To note the literary context of the era. After the 30s and 40s leading into the early 1950s, the hard-boiled, seedy place detective who scuffled around the desolate and sometimes sordid streets were at the forefront of pop literature consumption. This popular narrative form enabled her to access a much larger audience for the topic of urban planning, particularly those with not a background in urban planning, nor necessarily a background in architecture or social sciences. In 1954, she was sent to Philadelphia to cover recent developments by architect Edmund Bacon. Upon returning from the assignment, she surprised her editors with a harsh critique of Bacon's form and result in the Philadelphia project. 2 years later, she attended a conference at Harvard and ended up standing in for the scheduled speaker, in which she noted her first critique of the current urban planning and city planners in America. She felt Bacon and the planners in New York were not fully grasping what made the city work. Notably, the chaos and disorder which so many architectural planners sought to quell. Jacobs felt this disorder was in fact a strength of the city. Later on, this would be one of the fundamental precepts behind her street ballet conceptualization. With a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, she was able to produce The Death and Life of Great American Cities, and the manuscript was published in 1961. Notable in the Dickinsonian tradition of surveying the modern city from upscale areas to slum, many Americans were familiar with this literary form. This ability for storytelling would set the table for Jacobs when urban renewal and freeways came to New York City, which would ultimately threaten her Greenwich Village neighborhood. The Lower West Side, which included Greenwich Village, contained a neighborhood very diverse, from both middle class to some upper class, as well as fairly intense poverty. But it would also be important to note the cultural and connective explosions that were coming out of the region at the time. Greenwich Village was a hotbed for music, poetry, and counterculture with the Beat generation. Everyone from Jimi Hendrix to Andy Warhol and the beat writer and poets of the generation all conglomerated around this area. It is important to note the wealth generation and entrepreneurial aspects of the arts in this particular section of New York. As urban renewal took hold from the federal level, the battle lines would be set between the New York master builder Robert Moses and JACOBS' interest in preserving her neighborhood. With the freeways and the slum clearances coming, it was a battle that would be ultimately engraved in the lore of New York City forever. Moses, the master builder and city planner of New York City, had already a long legacy of capital improvements and large real estate projects in New York City even before the war. As the war ended and the wonders of modern technology gripped the victorious nation, a supporter of the Corbusian ideals of architecture and city planning, residential properties could be built upward and the ground level could be designed to cater to the automobile. Not much concern was placed on removing old neighborhoods and displacing the residents. Moses's outlook was much like that of Le Corbusier, where he thought the master planners felt that drastic measures were required to remediate all of the ills of inner city poverty and squalor. When the Housing Act of 1949 passed with its Title 1, 2, and 3, including federal dollars for public housing, as well as slum clearance and FHA guaranteed loans, the jailbreak was on. Huge sums of money would fly from Washington to the cities of America to raise neighborhoods and build new public housing. In the case of New York City, Robert Moses enjoyed an almost absolute control. As the head of upwards to 12 government offices, he would ultimately be the arbiter of where and what got built and whom was displaced. As Moses was an unelected official, there are certainly questions in regards to the democratic allocation of funds, in regards to all of the 1949 Housing Act's machinations and results. Moses created and led numerous public authorities that gave him an autonomy somewhat unique. Through these authorities, he controlled the purse strings of millions of dollars. Champion of the car and the freeway, Moses worked closely with American auto builders such as GM to promote mutual interests. Famously, Moses would refer to the issue of trying to get things, especially large infrastructure projects, done in an urban area, that one had to use a cleaver or an axe, stating, "But when you operate in an overbuilt metropolis, you have to hack your way with a meat axe." The counterculture rising in America and in Greenwich Village around JACOBS' neighborhood would be the perfect foil for Moses's unaccountable power. Moses had been trying to complete the project whereby freeways would be overlaid on the southern portions of Manhattan. The Lomax, or Lower Manhattan Expressway, had been variously planned and recoiled and then replanned and reproposed for many years. As fate would have it, the latest incarnation of the plan would level JACOBS' neighborhood in Greenwich Village, as well as the neighboring areas of Soho and Little Italy, in order to make clearance for both a freeway and Le Corbusier-style high-rise housing. With her skills for public relations and writing, Jacobs was well suited to lead the resistance group, which managed several protest sit-ins and other public engagements that displayed a unique flair for capturing the public's attention. On April 10th, 1968, Jacobs found a way to terminate the freeway plan once and for all. The State Department of Transportation was holding a public meeting on the Lower East Side to inform residents about Lomex's project and to solicit feedback. It was a pro forma meeting, hastily scheduled so that the state could say it had fulfilled its role of being publicly accountable. Of the meeting, Jacobs went to the stenographer's area and ripped up the meeting's notes and minutes, declaring that this was no meeting at all. She was eventually arrested and would have to litigate in order to deal with the charges for many years to come. Eventually, she would be nearly exonerated as the charges were dropped to various minor misdemeanors. Important is the battle had been won. The Lomax Expressway in Lower Manhattan would not be built, and Greenwich Village, Soho, and Little Italy remain today as thriving yet gentrified neighborhoods. In the field of urban planning that one would want to note in terms of Jacobs include the street ballet. Going back to her speech at Harvard, the street ballet is her concept of the chaos occurring into the streets, that is the everyday succession of various mixed people and their mixed functions in a neighborhood is the lifeblood and ultimately the economic engine of the region. She encouraged planners to replicate this, almost an early predecessor to placemaking. Also notable is her concept of the eyes on the street. Things like bars, which one would not consider a positive thing on their block, Jacobs contradicted was a positive thing as it kept more eyes on the street and kept crime rates down. She argued that the large tower housing that did not expose residents to the outside or expose eyes on the public spaces was one of the main detractors of safety and then health of the neighborhood. Advocate for sidewalk safety and mixed use where bars, restaurants, shops, residential areas, people of different backgrounds, tourists, locals, higher class, lower class would all mix into a soup that was ultimately the lifeblood of the city. One might draw parallels between her economic vision on the small local economic scale and today's current cluster analysis. Jacobs' legacy is one where she attacked professional planners, stating that behavioral observation contradicted everything that they were engaging in terms of theory and practice. As advocacy planning emerges in the 60s, she is a prime example of both advocacy planning, civil disobedience, as well as the power of community organization in terms of a neighborhood or city's planning process. In terms of tenants, the four major components of Jacobs' urban planning theory is that of mixed use, small buildings, aged buildings, and preservation thereof, as well as increased density. Later in life, her study of the economic underpinnings, causations, and functionality of the urban setting would be fundamentally based on these four principles. It is also notable that these principles can be seen today in many locations and municipalities' planning efforts, where they try to create enterprise zones or mixed-use areas to reinvigorate a hollowed-out community. An interesting duality to Jacobsonian perspectives is the coexistence of both grassroots activism, but yet a full-throated support of free markets and small-scale capitalism at the neighborhood level. A critique of Jacobs that has emerged is that of gentrification as it relates to preservation, where large buildings were not built, which would create ultimately concentrated poverty. The preserved buildings often provide a host for higher income residents to move in and force the existing residents out. Finally, it may be important to note the resulting form that one can see in American cities in terms of the ideals and concepts Jacobs espoused. The blue squares are Greenwich Village on the west side of Manhattan, bordering the river. As you can see, the diverse neighborhoods with different types of mixed buildings leading right up to the waterfront. Conversely, in the red squares are pictured current-day Philadelphia, where expressways, 95 and I-76, had been run parallel to these rivers. One can see the difference in the resulting development on the right. In Philadelphia, where freeways were laid next to the river and large corridor freeways were laid over neighborhoods, the development has still not recovered. One only needs to open a recent newspaper to see how Philadelphia planners, decades later, are still trying to reconnect the waterfront to the city. What neighborhoods would have thrived had that not occurred?